Course on the Cold War, our studies have focused on Europe, the division between East and West running down the centre of Europe called the Iron Curtain. To the west we have the capitalist democracies like Britain and France dominated by the United States. To the east we have the communist dictatorships dominated by the Soviet Union. The Cold War so far has been a story of those relations between the two sides gradually getting worse and worse and worse. The Cold War is gradually coming to a stalemate. Neither side can secure victory over the other, neither side will back down. Both sides are building up their weapons, both sides using those weapons to deter the other side using their weapons against them, mutually assured destruction. But looking at it from a global perspective rather than just a European one, the Russians have the greater problem. If you look at Russia on a map of the world, you will see that to the north, they're surrounded by ice in the Arctic. To the south, they have no access really to any warm waters. To the east, we have the United States, and to the west, we have Western Europe. Ranged around the borders of the Soviet Union are numerous American bases and American friends. Russia is surrounded, and therefore, as the picture shows below, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, will now do whatever he can do to re-establish himself as a player in the Cold War and get leverage over the United States. The opportunity for that will come with the Cuban Revolution, the island of Cuba in the Caribbean, 90 miles south of the United States. Firstly then, what I need you to do is to be able to work your way through these 10 key events and link them to the correct date. I'd like you to pause the video in a moment and then attempt to link those dates together. Please pause now. Okay, so the creation of the Warsaw Pact was 1955 in response to the creation of NATO in 1949. Please, again, make notes on any of these that you are not clear about, understand the significance of, or are not familiar with. The Long Telegram was 1946, written by George Kennan, where he explained the Soviet Union's attitude towards America. The Berlin Airlift was in 1948, Stalin's desire to drive the West out of West Berlin, leading him to blockade the city, and the West, instead of declaring war, tried to fly air supplies in instead. The Potsdam Conference, the last of the big three conferences in 1945, attended by Truman for the first time, Attlee for the first time, and Stalin. The Vienna Summit was the summit between Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy in 1961. The creation of NATO, 1949. The collective security of the NATO alliance. If one is attacked, all of them will act as if they are attacked together. NATO was created in response to the perceived Soviet aggression over the Berlin Airlift of 1948. The Hungarian uprising was 1956. 3 years after the death of Stalin, the Hungarians believed that Khrushchev would be sympathetic towards them reforming communism. They got that very wrong. The Truman Doctrine, the first step of the Americans to attempt this policy of containing the Soviet Union, stopping the Soviet Union expanding any further. The Tehran Conference was the most productive of the 3 conferences during World War II. That was attended by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The end of World War II and the defeat of Hitler was 1945, and of course this showed the lack of long-term friendship between the countries that had fought the Nazis. Their hatred of Hitler blinded them to their hatred of each other. So, again, another series of questions. You need to make sure that you know the answer. You need to be proactive and independent learners in making notes on anything you are unsure about. Which leaders were present at the Tehran Conference in 1943? Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Who wrote the Long Telegram in 1946? George Kennan. What did the Truman Doctrine of 1947 say? That is the key word of containment. The Soviet Union would not be allowed to spread its influence. What was the name given to the aid money given to European countries to try and prevent the spread of communism? It was the Marshall Plan. What was the name given to the organisation whose job it was to coordinate communist parties throughout Europe? Cominform. What was the Soviet response to Marshall aid called? Comecon. When did the Berlin airlift begin? 1948. What does NATO stand for? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What was the Soviet response to NATO called, and when was it formed? That is the Warsaw Pact of 1955. When was Sputnik launched? 1957. When was the Hungarian uprising? 1956. Who was the leader of the Hungarian uprising? Imre Nagy. When was the Paris summit? 1960. And the Vienna summit was 1961. When was the Berlin Wall constructed? 1961. When did JFK visit Berlin? 1963. Our story now moves on. Previously, we were looking at the relationship between Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union and President Eisenhower of the United States. In 1960, the presidential election returns John Kennedy to the White House. He will be the youngest president ever to become the leader of the United States. And here it is illustrated, the relationship between the two men. You take a look at the picture and see if you can understand what you are looking at. Please pause. The picture is an illustration of mutually assured destruction. Both men are sat on each other's nuclear weapon. Both men have their finger on the button, and they are engaged in a constant struggle to make sure that their country, their ideology, remains the most dominant one in the world. To destroy one would be to destroy both. Here's the map of the world from a different perspective. This is looking down on the North Pole. And this illustrates something that was mentioned at the start of this particular film. If you look at the map, you will see that to a large extent, the Soviet Union is surrounded by NATO, America, and other American allies. To the west, North America and Europe. To the southeast, Turkey, and then through the Middle East and into Southeast Asia and the Far East. The Cold War is coming to a stalemate. Now, we put yourself in the position with what we now know of the context of Nikita Khrushchev. I'll present you with a series of events. You must work your way through this, and you need to determine what you think would be the correct answer. As you go through, make a list of your responses. So firstly, Cuba is 90 miles from the United States coast. The US Monroe Doctrine, going way back to the 19th century, says that Cuba comes under the United States sphere of influence because it's right next door. However, there are rebels on the island of Cuba. If you were Khrushchev, would you A. do nothing, B. criticize the American capitalists, C. secretly help the Cuban rebels with money and weapons? Now your job here will be to make a note. Number one, what would you do? A, B or C? Remember the cartoon you saw earlier. You are in a constant struggle with the United States, but mutually assured destruction will be the outcome of any war between the two of you. So as much as you want to strengthen the Soviet Union's position, as much as you want to make yourself as the leader of Russia stronger, you have ultimately got to avoid a war with the United States. As we go through the next slides, you just need to write down A, B, or C and pause at the appropriate point. How did you do? If you answered mostly A's, you are weak and would be a terrible leader of the Soviet Union. The United States would simply crush you far, far too quickly. If you answered B's, you are doing better, but you are too hesitant and your delaying tactics could result in the Soviet Union losing the Cold War. If, however, you answered C's, you took the same decisions as Nikita Khrushchev. He would be happy. So, some background context. Cuba is 90 miles from the American coast. The American Monroe Doctrine, as we already said that America said to the rest of the world that Cuba and the islands all around the United States were in America's backyard. They were America's sphere of influence. Everyone else should keep out. Cuba is ruled by Fulgencio Batista. He was doing very well for himself, but the Cuban people were very poor. Cuba was very popular with American holidaymakers, and American companies owned an awful lot of the Cuban economy. The Americans backed and supported Batista, despite him being a very unpleasant individual. In 1959, however, rebels led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrew Batista. At this time, Castro was not a communist. But in order to improve the lives of the Cuban people, Castro took over many American companies. He nationalized them. This made him very unpopular with Americans. America, in response, told Castro they would not buy any Cuban sugar. This was Cuba's main export crop. It was the way in which they earned their money. And this was very bad news for Cuba. Khrushchev, seeing an opportunity here, offers to buy the Cuban sugar. As the relationship between Russia and Cuba becomes closer and closer, Castro declares himself a communist. And now America has a communist neighbor, literally miles off the coast of Florida. Consequently, the Americans decide that they will need to get rid of Castro and overthrow his government on the island of Cuba. But as the cartoon at the start of the lesson showed, any direct attack by the Americans on Cuba is likely to start a war between the Americans and the Russians, Castro and Khrushchev being such close friends now. So the Americans organize an invasion of Cuba by Cubans who are now living in Florida. They are known as the Cuban exiles. And they will form an organization called La Brigada. And La Brigada will be backed by the CIA, and the Americans will attempt an invasion of Cuba. That was the plan that President Eisenhower had. But of course, he was president in 1959, and when the operation takes place in 1960, President Kennedy is now in charge. Because of the decisions Kennedy makes, the invasion at the Bay of Pigs fails, and this drives Castro even closer into the arms of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had seen an opportunity. He was not happy at the way that the United States had weapons pointed at the USSR all around Europe. He decided, at Castro's request, to place weapons on Cuba. He thought he would test the young American President Kennedy. As Khrushchev was unable to reunite Berlin, he saw an opportunity to challenge the United States over Cuba and break the deadlock of the Cold War. What were the most important stages then in the development of the relationship between Cuba and the USSR? You have that printed in your booklet, or you can download the sheet. And what I want you to do is put the most important factors in the development of Soviet-Cuban relations into the pyramid. It's very important that you include the four most important. The most important at the top, second, third, and then at least one more on the bottom line. You must explain why each of the statements that you've put on the pyramid are important. Those are the statements. Read through the statements and identify the four most important stages in the relationship. Obviously, you can go further. The exam practice attached to this lesson is on the PowerPoint, and you would do well to attempt the exam question.